Welcome to The Lead, the New Lines Magazine podcast. I'm Faisal Yafai, and this is a podcast where we delve into some of the biggest ideas, events, and personalities from around the world. I'm joined today by Karl Sharro, an architect and satirist. If you're on Twitter, you probably know him better as Karl Remarks. His satirical tweets about Middle Eastern politics regularly go viral and have even earned him a book deal with Saqi Books. And then God created the Middle East and said, "Let there be breaking news." In June, as the scandals piled up, then Prime Minister Boris Johnson refused to resign, even as his former allies turned on him. A constitutional crisis loomed as MPs began to realize that they would have to force him out of office. For many, recalling the many long and bloody revolts against British colonialism of the 20th century, the irony was too delicious to ignore. And for Karl, it was definitely too delicious to ignore. He tweeted, "It's great that the British are finally discovering how difficult it is to get rid of British rule." Karl Sharro, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Faisal. Great to be with you, and great to be part of this great podcast.
Thank you. I had to start with that one because that really went very far and wide. It's kind of illustrative of the jokes that work so well for you on Twitter.
Yeah, I hope I'm not repeating myself too much. You don't want to be complacent in this online comedy business. But you know where all of that comes from is I thought I have to live with this situation. Obviously, I live in London and I have to suffer from the economic crisis, the political dysfunction. So the least I could do to get back is make get some comedy material out of it. So the collapse of the country has been very rewarding for me personally, in my whatever comedic capacity I have.
There are a lot of parallels that can be drawn between. This is part of the jokes that you make, that you draw these parallels between the Middle East as it is, or the Middle East as it is perceived, and the West.
Yeah, correct. There's an underlying theme. I mean, I'm not sort of ideologically committed to it. It's not like my personal anti-imperialist campaign. It's just a way of poking fun, I guess, at Western narratives, certain Western narratives and attitudes, that some of which are embodied in this kind of Orientalist attitude, others are embodied in this overbearing kind of paternalistic attitude to the Middle East, as if it needs Western kind of nurturing in order to become fully democratic, and so on and so forth. So it's just a way as kind of kicking back at that. And I think particularly since 2016 and all the kind of dynamics around Brexit in Britain, Trump, and not just to limit it to those, there's a kind of a general sense of dysfunction you see creeping, in the West. I think it was a way to kind of start to utilize that dynamic to say, the way you historically looked at us is kind of wrong. Let's illustrate, through kind of a humorous take on that. But B is also saying, you're not in a great position yourself, so maybe take a break and stop lecturing us.
Yeah. You do sometimes think, when you look at what is happening, if this was happening to another country, you have street protests, you have the passing of one hereditary monarch, the passing of the crown to another hereditary monarch, the involvement in a war, the economic crisis. If this were happening in the Middle East, people would say, "Oh my God, what's going on over there?"
I mean, it's seriously, at this point, I think Britain in particular, it's not about, I used to think is we should start sending, Arab foreign or Middle Eastern foreign correspondents to come here and cover Britain the way, let's say, the BBC, without particularly wishing to signal them out, Western kind of media outlets cover the Middle East. And now I think the time for that has passed. It's time to send in the anthropologists. I think what's been happening over the past few years, forget about the past few years, right? The past few days, what's been happening in Britain, you definitely need some serious anthropology done on explaining what's happening, right? It's like just things spiral completely out of control. So it said, I respect that there's a death of a very beloved monarch, but the reaction of people, right, it became a mark of respect to just go out and cancel anything that's happening out there. That is a mark of respect. Let's cancel children's football, let's cancel people's holidays, all sorts of things. And then things spiral out of control. And you think there has to be some serious anthropological investigation done to understand these people.
For the audience, I should just point out we're speaking in the mourning period between the passing of the Queen and the lying in state of the Queen. So that's the period you're talking about, with all this pomp and ceremony and the 24-hour coverage of the news. And as you say, we've just passed the first weekend since the death of the Queen. Lots of things were cancelled. We at the magazine cancelled an event in London, and lots of things have been cancelled for this coming weekend.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I understand, it's a historic occasion. It deserves to be marked with the requisite level of respect. But what I'm trying to say is, and I was going to point out to this the other day, is when they were doing the gun salutes, right? I didn't manage to kind of phrase it in any funny way, but it's kind of reminded me when someone dies or when there's a wedding in the Middle East and people start shooting guns in the air. And I was like, well, hang on a minute. This is the same thing, except these guys are wearing a uniform and pointing generally in the same direction.
But did you say that, though?
No, I didn't. I just say I saved it for you, Faisal, for this podcast.
but actually, I mean, well, thank you for that. The audience will appreciate it. But the reason it's interesting is, we're now 4-5 days after the passing of the Queen. And we are still, I think, in a period where I don't think satire or comedy would be well received. I don't think the kind of jokes you're talking about would be well received by the British public, which, of course, we have a lot of Americans on our team. And that's something the Americans have really struggled with, the idea that things need to be cancelled, the idea that there needs to be this excessive deference after so many days.
Yeah, but I mean, Americans are the last people to speak. And I'm speaking in very broad, sweeping generalization now, which is what I do all the time. I mean, they don't understand monarchy, but they go way more hysterical over, other kind of public figures. So I don't think they're necessarily the ones to speak. But I think
was that you? Sorry, Karl. Was that you who made the joke that the Americans are into monarchy because they want to love the monarchy without the responsibility of living with it? Is that you?
Yeah, I tweeted that. I tweeted that yesterday, and it's quite an interesting one. It's an interesting phenomenon because they can't stop talking about it, and essentially, it's the whole reason why they sought independence. Is they wanted to have an opinion about it, and the royals in particular, without suffering the consequences. So it's a very interesting. I know a lot of people would be very reluctant to satirize this moment, but I'm diving right in, and admittedly, it's not very successful. Emotions are raw, but it goes back to a point that when I started sort of tweeting, blogging comedically about the Middle East, and it was early days of what was called then the Arab Spring or the Arab uprisings. And the Western audience was sort of kind of taking that on board and, it's funny and it's a way to explain the Middle East with humor. And they were very receptive. And then when things started to kind of go pear-shaped in the West, and let's say, I don't know, for a large part of my audience, like the election of Trump is equal to a natural disaster, right? And I start laughing about it and joking about it in the same way. They turn around and say, well, actually, you can't joke about this. It's too serious. It's about us.
Yeah.
Right? That's the subtext, of course. But, that's what's implied, right? It was okay for you to kind of make jokes when all of that stuff was happening in the Middle East and people were dying and whatever. And I'd like to think I dealt with it, with a sensitivity and a sense of responsibility. But at the end of the day, as a satirist, I think you have to kind of find any opportunity to kind of say what you want to say, right? And I think what I found interesting in the past few years is when it comes to the actual West, when things are happening here, I mean, somebody actually was offended the other day because I was joking about climate change, and they were like, "No, you can't joke about that." I'm like, "No, you can actually joke about anything. It depends how you do it and how you satirize it." And secondly, the more important point goes back to this kind of what you mentioned in your introduction and kind of dealing with the topics that I deal with is let's, don't be hypocritical. If you were happy to laugh about events happening everywhere, don't be oversensitive now when things are happening to you.
Mm.
And I think those kind of things, these forms of dissent and things like that, are very important even within Western societies, because there's a creeping sense of conformity that's quite stifling and needs people to kick back against it. And now effectively what happens is, particularly from a left-wing perspective, if it's sort of, something like the Queen's passing or something like that, you'd find a lot more kind of left-wing people willing to kind of stand up and, say, this is kind of gone on too much. The reaction, they're willing to be critical, right? But at the
Mm.
same time, there's a lot of other trends that kind of escalate and become stifling, and there's tendency towards conformity that, the left at that point would be kind of willing to act as those kind of guardians of what's acceptable speech, what's acceptable to laugh about. And I come from a much more kind of anarchic point of view, where I want to be able to laugh at everything and poke fun at everything and not be restrained by these self-appointed guardian of what is acceptable or polite speech. So I'll
Mm.
use any opportunity to kind of, say that, and always kind of try to play on the parallels as between the Middle East and the West as a humorous device to say these things.
I mean, I think that there are sort of 2 points there, and we've dived into it a bit. I was hoping to start off gently, but actually we've dived straight into it.
Did you wanna ease into it?
Yeah, I thought that was the way in, but you started with Trump. You just dove right in there. But I think there's 2 things going on, isn't there? I mean, there's one, as you say, the West. Again, we're exaggerating to some degree, because I mean, to some degree, both of us are the West now. But anyway,
Correct.
that sometimes the jokes that are about the Middle East at moments of immense crisis, I mean, wars and invasions and occupations, really serious things, people being killed, people being maimed, those kind of jokes pass. But then when really serious things happen in the West, Brexit, Trump, the passing of the Queen, these sorts of things, people cry deference, respect. You have to understand what's going on. These are political things. Don't make jokes about them. So that's one aspect of it.
Yes, absolutely. That's what kind of I was trying to allude to, and it's to me it's kind of a glaring kind of contradiction in attitudes. I mean, you look at my presence on Twitter, which is really my kind of main presence anywhere, not just online. it's the same audience, right? We're willing to kind of accept these jokes at times of crisis, wherever, and then you see this sensitivity when it comes to things happening internally in the West, and it's kind of now you can't joke about it, and to me it's not just kind of I don't want to kind of bang on about this as if I'm some sort of preacher trying to kind of make Western people lighten up. That's not what I'm trying to do. I'm just kind of trying to use it from a position of trying to make a broader point about free speech, about freedom of satire, about freedom of opinion, and to say there are various forms of orthodoxies that are becoming enshrined in these societies here in Western countries. Some of them have been formalized and some of them have been not. But it's my way of kind of kicking back at that, using these kind of devices where they'll, the same people that be happy to say, they'll protest against someone holding up a sign against the king and being arrested. They'll say this is an attack on free speech. And then the next day, some other kind of free speech violation happens, and they're like, "Oh, you know what? But free speech is not sacred, and people have a right to be offended, and speech has to have consequences." So these are, to me, are really hypocritical attitudes. These matters are very serious, very important. That we need to have a consistency of approach, a consistency of principle towards them. And kind of what I like is a lot of your writers on Newsline magazine kind of really understand that and take it on board. And I appreciate what was said in the aftermath on attack on Salman Rushdie, for example, right? And it's not necessarily attitudes that you see everywhere, or the same kind of eagerness that a lot of Middle Eastern people, of writers of Middle Eastern background, are kind of eager for this freedom of speech, because they have been deprived of it for so long. Whereas you have people who, in theory, should be more comfortable with it, kind of in the West, kicking back against it now. So it all comes from that kind of position for me personally.
Well, that was the Rushdie attack was one of the few times actually I've seen you, our producer Josh called it break character. I mean, you were more like your tweets were more serious in that in the aftermath. I wondered why that was. Perhaps you felt it affected you in some way.
Well, I mean, it's a little bit of a long story, but yes, I did break character because sometimes, in the face of cowardice, intellectual cowardice, you have to be a little bit more blunt and serious, I guess. Because when you see people going around trying to justify, without necessarily always putting it in so many words, an attack on an elderly person, defenseless elderly person for things he wrote, and you see the cowardly kind of attempt to say, oh yeah, but he offended a lot of people and so on and so forth, that becomes a form of justification. I draw the line at that, and this is a kind of attitudes by people when I was writing scathing and doing kind of videos and stuff, scathing satire of ISIS at the time, right? And I was being sent lots of kind of negative messages and things like that. There were a lot of people saying, yeah, you're right, you're standing up to them, you're right. I'm not that heroic, but this is something big that's happening, and we need to kind of deflate it a little bit as a phenomenon. And then they turn around and it comes to an issue like Salman Rushdie, and it's you can't conceivably not stand by his right not to be violently attacked. I mean, I don't know how I can put it any more bluntly. And this is what, in a sense, you see the kind of the weasel words and the kind of the lack of having any courage around that is what kind of, yes, it did make me break character. It's actually making me break character again now. I should think of something funny to say.
Well, because we haven't got to the part where I read out some of your tweets. I think a lot of people who've joined this podcast, perhaps they don't know you all that well, would be like, I thought this was going to be about jokes. Where's the guy's preaching about free speech for the last 18 minutes? I'm just kidding. But actually, there's a serious point there, because the double standards that you talked about, when you talk about ISIS, it isn't merely double standards of the West. It is the case, for example, that Westerners don't like it when their own sacred cows are attacked. But it's also the case that the Middle Easterners, again, we're talking very broadly, will be very comfortable with you making jokes that, poke at imperialism and colonialism, so on and so on. But then when it touches on things that they find sacred or that they get upset about or things that are important to their societies, they turn around and say exactly what the Westerners say. This stuff is serious. This isn't for jokes. You can't explain it in one line. These sorts of things.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And I, tend to, if you look, I might not do it all the time simultaneously, but if you look at sort of my 10, 12, whatever it is on 12 years on Twitter doing this, I'd like to think I've actually offended everybody along the way. And actually, someone actually wrote an article about that and listed everyone that have criticized, from dictators to Hezbollah to, whatever entity you can, to obviously like Western imperialist pigs and no. that was the joke, Faisal. I should tell you before I joke. And
please explain it to me. Yeah, thanks. But Karl, I mean, it's actually one of the nicest compliments I've had. That joke, the one that we talked about earlier, the one where we said, "Oh, the British are getting rid of the British." We have a colleague who sent it to me and she said, "Oh, this is really funny. Are you ghostwriting tweets now?" My God. Which for me, honestly, one of the nicest things anybody could say to. But I think, good. I'll come back to this because I just want to intercede with this joke, because I think it's really intriguing that you do have such a style that is recognizable. I mean, even earlier when I said, was that the joke that you made? It was a very Karl Sharro joke. Even if it wasn't you, in that case it was, but even if it wasn't you, it's very much of the style. Like there's a certain kind of humor that people associate with you, I think. You become like Churchill or something. People associate all these random quotes that have happened throughout history, and they say, "Oh, Churchill said it all."
Yeah, I don't have as many colonies as he does. I mean, very few colonies, if any at all. But aside from that, I'm just exactly like Churchill.
Okay, well, let's talk about
Yeah.
the second part, because you
Yes.
talked about 12 years that you've been on Twitter, and we were
Yes.
talking about how there's a sort of double standard, but also that segues into a second aspect, which is the change in the climate of what is satirical, what is funny, what comedy is acceptable. That I think is a slightly different thing than the double standards. I think that sometimes people refer to it as being about a new woke era. I wonder how you interpret it. It's something to do with a difference in the way a new generation, what they think is acceptable.
Yeah, I mean, that is a great point. Personally, I think putting it on the new generation is unfair. I know we all, I don't know exactly how old you are. I'm 50 years old now, but I know people in my generation of 40-year-olds like to blame everything on the younger generation and say, we were more sophisticated, we were funnier, we were more open to humor and things like that.
Mm,
But to me, it's not. I see these kind of cultural trends that are about taking offense and kind of prescribing what's acceptable and kind of people towards people's sensitivities and things like that. These actually all emanate from boomers. Don't like kind of boom. It's this has been building up since the 60s. So I
mm,
don't think, not to kind of make a thesis about this whole thing. I think these tendencies are generally over the past few years have becoming and almost exponentially becoming more and more magnified to the
mm,
extent I'm genuinely since I actually joined Twitter on 2009, I think, so it's a little bit more, but let's say when I started talking about these topics 2011, so that's about 11 years. Even within those 11 years I see a huge decline in people's appetite to accept. I'm not saying, racist or chauvinist or statements like that. I'm saying any form of statement or humor that somehow might be perceived in a very elaborate way as offensive, right? And the way that I think about it is almost like someone is painting a house, let's say, right? And they do several coats, they go over several coats. It's almost like every year passes and there's a new layer that's been
mm,
added that makes people even more sensitive. I mean, people started to get offended over the most banal things. Stay away from politics and religion and things like that, just to locate this in a context. You look,
mm,
I'm a big football fan, I'm a big supporter of Liverpool Football Club, right? Whenever I see a football tweet, you just click on it, and just the amount of people for the most absurd statement that are so offended that they're willing, how dare you offend me? How dare you insult my team? And I was like, this is, we used to call this trash talk in when we played football or basketball. That's essential part of sport. If even sports fans are becoming so thin-skinned, right? It's
mm.
reflective of a broader cultural phenomenon where these prescriptions about respect and conformity and lack of offense that I perceive as very stifling are increasing exponentially, and they don't bode well for anyone.
I
This
mean,
is the real risk.
yeah, I mean, you said earlier that you locate this change among the boomers, and I didn't mean that it was from a young generation in a negative way. I actually think it's a positive thing. I do believe it is part of a new generation, but the reason I think it's a positive thing is that I think there's a new generation that is much more aware of power dynamics and much more willing to interrogate the ideas of it. So, for example, when you talk about, as you say, leave politics and religion aside, when you talk about jokes people might make among football fans and so on, I mean, any of us who have played any level of sport know that this kind of trash talk is there, but the trash talk sometimes does have a power dynamic to it. For example, sometimes it is an ableist joke. You're making fun of somebody for something they can't help. That, I think, is a generation pointing out that those jokes, as they would say, is not okay. And I think perhaps they're actually telling the sort of the wider society something.
Yeah, I mean, that's all fair enough. I think I made it very clearly that whenever you're kind of stepping some sort of bound that for example, you're being racist or whatever, you'd expect to be called on it, right? That's the whole part of the premise. Is if you want to live in this healthy society where people are free to express their opinion, they have to also free, I don't like these crybaby type of people who think free speech means, you have to kind of go around and nobody should criticize you. That's obviously not what it means. But my point is broader sense, where the more kind of there's a complexity of accumulation of prescribed secular, let's call them secular taboos, yeah? The
Okay.
more you kind of layer these things on top of each other, you end up kind of restricting a society. And I'll give you an example why I personally think it's very important for me, personally, from my background and my experience. And where, look, I'm originally half Lebanese, half Iraqi. I grew up between these two societies that are very skilled at dealing with tragedy and violence and war with humor, and very dark humor and bleak humor, and the kind of this subversive sense of transgression. Verbal transgression is a way to kind of deal with the situations around you. So it's very important to me on a cultural sense, and in a personal sense, in the way that I interact with my family and my friends. The problem then in having these limits of these transgressions being prescribed either formally, by which I mean speech codes that universities and other institutions are introducing, or what I call grassroots policing. That is, the people that take it upon themselves to not only say to you, it's not right to say this, but to get you fired from your job and just kind of punish you for something that you've said. Is the problem that when you do that, right, you lose this ability, this dynamism of society, the ability to even make mistakes, because you're being faced now by two sorts of pressures from above and below that are kind of regulating and prescribing. And these are things you go talk to anyone from a Middle Eastern or Arab background. These are things you struggle against all your life. You struggle against societal kind of norms and restriction, family norms and restriction, authoritarian norms and restriction. And you want to be consistent with yourself. You want to say that these transgressions should be dealt with through a kind of a freer form of critique rather than through a form of policing. And the distinction is very blurry. It's not clear cut. But this is, again, what kind of alarms me about a lot of people from the Middle East that were at the time of the Arab uprisings and everything, saying freedom and all of that. And then within the West, they become all of a sudden kind of very big fans of these forms, what I call inescapably, I call it censorship. There's no other words for it. And to me, that is not a healthy attitude to kind of have healthy societies that are able to discuss issues in serious manners. And the reason why I think it's also very important is, you've noticed in COVID, it was magnified, right? Wherever people can't find an outlet for whatever little dissent they have with what's happening around them, we've created an environment where it's very easy for them to go underground, some sort of digital underground that very soon can find a manifestation for itself in real life, and start kind of a breeding ground for conspiracies and things like that. So the effect of this kind of policing has very serious consequences. I'm not saying it's the cause of that. It's not having that kind of environment is what causes, conspiracy theories. No, it's kind of having that kind of environment will aid people to kind of seek like-minded people in a more underground kind of form, and start this fragmentation of society where every section of society has its own understanding of reality. So that's really where I come to it from. I understand the need to be kind of critical and aware of power dynamics, and I tweet about them and I write about them. But at the same time, you have to be able to have the freedom to transgress boundaries and without being policed. And that's very crucial to creativity.
So you don't accept that there is a certain positionality that you have as being somebody who lives in the West, a certain socioeconomic background, certain education, of course, that you're able to make jokes about things that are, for example, very real to people, not merely sacred, but things that are part of their daily life. This was the question I asked Isam Ulaykhat, who you probably know,
Of
the guy
course,
who
yeah.
created the satirical magazine Al Hudud, which is focused on the Middle East. That sometimes when you are making these jokes, don't you feel that you are attacking things that people hold dear? Like you're not just attacking some abstract concept, you're attacking something that is a part of their daily life.
Yeah, that is correct. But I always say it's how it's done and to what purpose it's done. And I think different people will do it in different ways. People more gratuitously than others, but and I can't pretend that I'm always doing kind of Lewin from a lofty position.
Yeah.
But ultimately, I think when you want to live in a society where uh, you go back to what we all want in the region, to have a sense of freedom and control over our lives, control our economic affairs, and the say that we have in government and things like that. That requires a measure of freedom. And part of that is fighting against the weight of traditions, the weight of established institutions, the ways of, very normalized, inherited ways of doing things that you want to be able to kick back against that, right?
Mm.
And you can't then go be very prescriptive and say that's because some people might say that this is very dear to me, then it acquires an automatic immunity from criticism.
Right. Just a
Because what
very.
I, yeah, because that then can apply to anything, and that is my point. It's people can't, for example, people who single out, just let's say Muslims, because Muslims get offended. They try to say that Muslims get offended when someone criticizes their religion, and they kind of try to single out as if that's an exception, when
Mm.
everybody's actually got to the point where they were offended about something. A vegan will get offended if you criticize every, as much as a Muslim will get offended if their religion got
Yeah.
attacked or criticized, or anybody will get offended in equal measures these days. uh, um, or feel offended, right? What they do about it is a different thing. So my point is, then, if for you to accept that just the only measure that will kind of give immediate protection for some of these institutions or feelings or whatever have is how passionately people feel about them, then we will have a problem, because that means
Mm.
anything that people feel passionately about, and that's precisely what a lot of extreme far right parties do now all across the globe, from India to Western Europe to Brazil, where they say, in the name of being offended, we perceive that this person has insulted us. We have a right to take justice in our own hands, or whatever, or censor them.
Yeah.
And this is where we contradict it ourselves as seemingly somewhat progressive or left wing or whatever you want to call it, just liberals, possibly. Is this is where we contradict ourselves, because in certain contexts we're like, no, you have to respect people's feelings and things like that. But then you realize that the people that are actually deploying this sense of you can't offend us to do all sorts of horrendous things are quite diverse and varied and extensive now, and they're practicing quite real power in society under the notion that you're not allowed to offend their beliefs. So this is what my problem with kind of prescribing this protection for certain ideas or feelings that people feel compassionate about.
Are you now? You have, I mean, over 200,000 followers. I mean, a huge, huge audience, one of the largest audience for a satirist, I think. Do you feel? Well, I was going to say, first of all, do you feel any sense of being more careful now that you know how many people are listening to your words? And then I suppose, secondly, do you feel any sense of representation, whatever that might mean to you?
No, I think that's an interesting question. Let me start with the representation, because I think it's the easier one in a sense. It's uh, I only represent myself at the end of the day, and I'm not part of any current or movement or ethnicity or anything like that that I'm trying to portray. And I've had an issue all the time when people try say to me, "Oh, you're trying to show that." Arabs can be funny, or trying to show, Middle Easterners are this or civilized or whatever. I mean, it's just, like, I find that absurd. I don't have any impulse to try to show my culture or my people or anything in any better light. That's not my responsibility. And anyone that kind of thinks low of them, I'm not interested in convincing them.
It's a very, very odd thing to think that you are trying to be funny to prove that you can be funny. It's a very odd way to do it.
Yes, it's a fair point.
If you're taking on the if you're taking on the mantle of responsibility, that's a strange one to take on.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really funny way of doing it. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But I think where it becomes like this question of representation is then, if you're seen, let's say, as the person who's doing the post-colonial satire or the anti-imperial satire or whatever, and then if you go and say something that goes against that and cuts across that, because I kind of contradict myself all the time, where people say we have a duty to uphold this kind of let's say satirical mission, and I'm like, no, that's totally absurd. Like, if you start taking yourself that seriously as a satirist or a comedian, you should like quit very quickly, right? And you should be able to say stupid things. And this is why I always do these, like, aside from the political stuff, I always do these kind of awful dad jokes, right? And or kind of just joke about like the normal things in life or whatever.
Some on our team would say that's the highest form of comedy.
Yeah, fair enough. Not my daughters. They don't say that. They just roll their eyes and they're daddy, not again. But and then this kind of takes on, the point of the responsibility to the audience and things like that. And I would like to think that I'm not kind of encumbered by that, but I think I'm lying, right? I'm not going to admit it to you, but I think I'm lying because, and it's kind of a very insidious form of self-censorship that you start to practice. And sometimes I'll kick back against it, right? And then I'll just kind of get a big way, and I'm not expecting you to sympathize with me here, Faisal, because I'm sure you would have been kind of, against me when I've said this thing, but you were decent enough not to say anything about it or join in the pile-up. But and I'll just take it, right? I'm like, even before I do it, I know there's going to be a massive kickback, and like thousands of people are just going to lay into me.
Are you talking about something specific, or
no? It happens all the time. Okay, I'll give you one example. And I'm not proud of it, but but I give you one example. So there was one time, I think it's the Euro Cup or something. I was watching a football game in a pub, and then the football game finished. There's lots of people, England playing, and then they lost. And then I go outside. It was stifling inside. I find a table with 4 chairs on it, and take one of the chairs, and I'm waiting for my friends to come and join me. And then these 3 Israeli guys come in, don't ask me if the table is free or anything, and just sit there. And they take the 3 other seats, and they start kind of talking amongst each other. And
the joke writes itself, really.
Right. So I wrote the joke, right? I put it on Twitter. And automatically, you start to get, I mean, I have to admit, some people found it funny and appreciate, the context in what was said. And others were just like, it went up to like, why are you being anti-Semitic? Why are you being... But the point is, to me, it wasn't even a political statement at the time. I was like, because exactly that feeling you just said is the joke writes itself, and how you put it, how you phrase it. And I'm going to tweet it. Of course, I'm going to tweet it. And I know there's going to be kickback, but I'm going to tweet it. And sometimes it would be like something that's poorly thought or whatever. But I think, look, I live with it. And people will criticize me. I won't delete it. I'll keep it there. And, it'll be what it will be. And that's part of how the whole thing has to work. And I think the more you kind of do of that, and the more you kind of don't accept the sense of responsibility, and I think the better it is for everyone, and especially for creative people. Because where we end up with social media in particular is I love this example when you read about Najib Mahfouz, the Egyptian novelist, the late Egyptian novelist and Nobel laureate, is a lot of his aura and the way he managed to write and understand Egyptian society, and is he always was kind of at a remote from society itself. He allowed himself a measure of distance, right? And as a result, he became a great observer. Let me stress very quickly that I'm not comparing myself to Najib Mahfouz in any way, shape, or form. But he was outside of that kind of, he allowed himself to be this observer. He would give very few interviews. He would, and as a result, he had that distance to write and think and experiment. And he produced, he's absolutely one of my favorite writers of all time, beautiful literature and beautiful novels. Okay. The problem that we have today is, as a writer, you kind of just immediately, on a daily basis, being subjected to the intrusions and opinions of millions of people. It's going to affect you. So we've ended up in a completely different situation. And if you don't have that inner resilience, that's going to affect the quality of your work, the quality of your thinking. And, that is not a healthy sort of position to be in. And that is my kind of feeling about that whole responsibility notion and how this public dialogue needs to be conducted.
But you talk about Naguib Mahfouz sort of removing himself from society to be an observer, but that isn't really what you are doing, because your satire relies on public approval or disapproval, but it relies on people retweeting it, finding the joke within it, saying it's funny. It relies on the applause that satirists and comedians need.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So this is then my point about, you have the conclusion that I kind of didn't make very well, is then as a result of that, because you're in that context, you don't have the benefit of that distance. You can't then add this additional layer of what's so-called politeness or responsibility or sense of deference around things. You just have to, take the risks and allow people to kind of beat you down occasionally, and just go through it. You'll come out of it. Nothing will happen to you, and you'll be more. I'm not necessarily talking about myself, but I can't call what I do art. But if you were a creative person and you're doing that and allowed yourself to go through it and kind of stand firm in the face of all this kind of critique and things like that, it'll be so much better for your art, right? This is my point, because invariably here the answer would be either cut off yourself completely from this social media, which is not an option for someone like me, in order to kind of create this autonomy for you to produce your work. Or you just want to throw your opinions out there. You're gonna have to roll with it, but learn how to kind of, that you have to break boundaries, you have to transgress. People are going to call you on it. People are going to be like, awfully critical of you, but you just kind of have to learn how to deal with it. Really, I don't see any other way around it. Certainly not what people suggest, which is kind of more policing of social media, outside of, obviously, like, I'm not, clearly, when people make rape threats and things like that, that obviously, I know how it would affect women and all these kind of things. Obviously that needs to be dealt with. But what I'm saying, if just someone is saying, you gave an opinion that's a really stupid opinion, that is not a ground for police, or even if they start calling you names or whatever, that is not grounds just to police the whole medium, so to protect our fragile, little egos. If you don't want to put yourself, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no. So you were saying earlier that sometimes people say, you have to have a representation. It's time to make a joke about the subject. Prove that you are willing to make a joke about the subject. That kind of thing. I'm sure people have asked that of you, and really, what you're explaining is that you need to have you need your representation, and your willingness to make the joke has to be about whether the joke is a good joke. That's the only internal metric. And if you don't have a good joke about it, you just leave the topic alone.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fair way of putting it. You've put it much better than me. I should have been interviewing you, Faisal. You've put it much better than me. But really, that is the measure, And I think it's if that's all you do, that is the measure of it. That's how it should be judged, and people should be malleable enough to understand that in order to make good comedy, make people laugh, you have to kind of transgress some boundaries. It all comes down to how well you can do it.
Yeah. Well, we've we've spoken for 45 minutes, almost the entirety of the podcast, and I haven't asked you my first question yet. So we have to go. It's really true. I haven't. It's right in front of me, and I haven't asked it yet. So let's go all the way back to the beginning, because what I wanted to do was I wanted to give people a flavor of the kind of things you are talking about. Some of the tweets. So here are some of the tweets that you have written in the past, and then I think what I'm trying to highlight from it. He says, trying to dissect the joke before the joke is made. But what I'm trying to highlight is that there's a political understanding that is required in order to make the joke. It's not just a one-line joke like the jokes Jimmy Carr make, which are kind of internally coherent and you don't need any outside context. You need certain context to be able to get what the joke is. So let me read a few. This was, I love how political analysts talk about the Arabs as a unit, like all 400 million of us sit around the village square and decide things. That was one. So 3 Jordanians walk into a bar. The king removes the prime minister and dissolves the parliament. So that's how all stories finish in Jordan, which I thought was, that one in particular. I mean, I'll talk about that, but I have to read you this one, which isn't political, but I think it's one of my favorite jokes that you have made. And it was part of a series that you did about trying to do one-liners about musicians, famous musicians in the Arab world. So this one was, of course, about Kulthum, and it goes, so Kulthum walks into a bar, walks into a bar, walks into a bar, walks into a bar.
I love that one.
I love it. It's brilliant. It's one of the best jokes.
I always said I wanted to quit after making that joke, because to me it was the perfect joke, and I knew I'd never equal it, and I never did.
Yeah, it's a really good joke. And it's one of those things. I mean, it stands the test of time. I think you made that quite a few years ago, but it's timeless, because once you know, and this is the point I'm making, that once you know the context of the joke, then it's funny. If you didn't know Kulthum's music, if it was about a musician that perhaps we're not familiar with, it wouldn't make any sense. The same with the Jordanian example.
No, it's true, and it's funny. Is that context is also like narrower than that, because it's not everyone who knows Kulthum is going to necessarily relate to that joke, because they might know Kulthum and not be familiar with or find the format of the bar jokes funny, right? And in Jordan, you need to know a bit more about the political system and stuff. So it tends to be like an intersection between a kind of a Western and a Middle Eastern audience. And it's like a very niche audience, right? They all follow me on Twitter, and that's probably them. I'm probably annoyed a lot of them over the years, but and they decided to unfollow me. But quite a lot of this Venn diagram of the people that would be the audience for this thing is very narrow. But yes, it requires a measure of understanding, even a certain political position in a way, to a certain extent. It's kind of, I think of it as it's the right kind of in this super globalized world of ours, and when you should all exist in between cultures, is kind of this natural ecosystem that I wanted to operate within.
But there's something also, certainly with the Jordan joke, and of course with the political analysis joke, there's a seriousness to the joke. I mean, you're lampooning something that is recognizable. Otherwise, if the audience doesn't have the context, they don't get it. But it's also recognizably absurd. I mean, for example, the Jordanian joke would apply to lots of countries. I mean, you could make that joke about Russia and people would get it, even if they didn't know the specific context of the politics of Russia. They'd go, oh, I see, I get it. The president removes the prime minister. Oh, I see, yeah, like that.
Yeah, that's true. But what I find interesting on that is, these formats existed for a long time, right? And people would play with them. For example, during the Cold War, they always have the joke about the American and the Russian, and the American would say one thing and the Russian would say one thing, and how it worked, right? So these formats existed, but they had kind of a certain ascribed who's going to be the hero in the end, who's going to be the butt of the joke, right?
Yeah.
Part of what I've been trying to do is turn around who these jokes apply to and how they work. And that's kind of part of it. Sounds very intellectual, but when it actually works, it's actually quite funny. But for example, the other day I was kind of thinking of this old joke. I haven't decided how I'm going to do it. I was thinking of this joke where it says, you know what the difference between heaven and hell is, where it's basically in heaven the French are the cooks, the
Oh
engineers
yeah,
are the
that's a very
Germans.
famous joke. Yeah,
Yeah, right?
yeah,
And then in hell, right?
yeah.
It's where the English are the cooks. And then I was like, if you're updating this joke, right? The English are the cooks.
Well, I mean, I'll read it. I just looked it up because I want to read it because I know this from podcasts I listen to where somebody starts telling a story or starts telling a joke and you go, oh, what's the end of it? So I'll just read it for the audience. And this is, I don't know where it comes from. It's a kind of, you see it on T-shirts, you see it on posters. It's just something, I don't know if you know the origin of it.
No, it's
No,
lost in the midst of
in the
time.
midst of time, yeah. It's probably Churchill. So it goes like this. Heaven is where the police are British, the cooks are French, the mechanics are German, the lovers are Italian, and it's all organized by the Swiss. Hell is where the chefs are British, the mechanics are French, the lovers are Swiss, the police are German, and it's all organized by the Italians. And it's a funny joke because every person, I think, every group in there gets a little bit of something positive and something negative.
Yeah, I think it's perfect. For that balance. But then, so I thought the way to do it, right? If you want to say something about Britain today and express your frustration with everything, is basically you start off by saying you describe what heaven is like, right? And hell, you start by saying the cooks are British. So are the policemen, so are the engineers. The English just do everything. That's the definition of it. Yeah. Because it seemed to me like, just general dysfunction over the last 6 years is where they don't seem to be able to know how to do anything. And just everything is kind of escalating through it. For God's sake, what were they doing arresting people with signs that said, "Not my king"? I know this is not the forum. Sorry, Faisal.
No, I wanted to keep going with the heaven because I actually, many years ago, I actually wrote a version for the Arab countries of that because I thought it was very funny. But it wasn't very funny because perhaps I'm not very funny. But also there was a sort of more serious reason the joke didn't work. And it's related to something I wanted to ask you about the context. The reason that one didn't work is that I think in order for this joke to work, and we are interrogating it rather a lot for something which is on a T-shirt, but the reason it works is that the Brits understand about themselves that the police service is generally good, with apologies to what is going on currently in London, and that the chefs are not the greatest. And the Italians understand that, their food and perhaps their lovers are good, but their organization isn't. But when it came to try to write something about the Arabs, I don't think people sufficiently knew enough things about different Arab countries. I mean, you have links to multiple Arab countries. I've lived in a whole bunch of them. If people don't know enough of what makes the Egyptians funny or what makes the Lebanese disorganized, then they won't really get the joke.
Yeah, I think a couple of things with that. It's interesting because I tried to work with that for a very long time and it had its limitation. I'll tell you what it is. It's not that people don't know necessarily, but they wouldn't give a certain characteristics necessarily, let's say, to a Syrian versus an Egyptian. You're not going to get this kind of overly prescribed division of labor within that. But secondly, for Arabs or Middle Easterns, every one of them, for the good things, they think they're the best at everything, right?
Right.
And in terms of like, if they're talking about how bad things are for them, everybody thinks everything is the worst for them, right? So nobody's going to win either a boasting contest between various Arabs or a kind of how bad things are for them, because everyone's going to go like, no, our rulers are the worst. No, our economy is the worst. No. So you never get to that neat division of labor. And you're gonna have to reinvent that joke, but you've given me a kind of a mission now to
well, I'd like to see you
to attempt that joke.
I'd like to see you do that joke because I think it was related to a point I wanted to ask you about the whether you think that some of the jokes that you make can only be made by you. It's this kind of positionality thing that you identify as an Arab and you are able to make these jokes. I think you have some link to Lebanon. You're able to make jokes about Lebanon in the way that perhaps you wouldn't be able to, for example, I guess Morocco. I don't know if you have a link there, things like that.
Yeah, no. So I'm gonna I'm gonna give you a massive kind of scoop now, right? I don't actually identify specifically as anything that strongly, right? I just do it for the jokes. and there's a whole kind of strand in Seinfeld about that, like someone converts to Judaism just so he can have the freedom to tell Jewish jokes, right?
Right.
So I come from a very malleable and diverse kind of cultural background, and I don't overtly, I'll identify enough as an Arab, enough to be able to capable make these jokes. But I'm also kind of, I have Aramean heritage and Syriac heritage and all sorts of things that are combined. So I don't think you can draw these lines very neatly. In our region, on our part of the world, and I think, but I'm sufficiently embedded in a lot of these things to be able to make these jokes. But that's
But I
also
wasn't, just one thing, Karl,
so
because
yeah.
I'm not saying that you can't make these jokes because of who you are. I'm saying, do you think that the public would accept those jokes? So you talked, for example, about Aramean heritage, which is a minority within the Arab world that many people wouldn't know a great deal about. If you were to make a joke about that heritage, two Armenians walk into a bar, I think some people, if they don't know that you have that heritage, would say, oh, you're criticizing this minority, you're making jokes about this minority, like that.
Yes, it's absolutely spot on, and I kind of was leading to this. So it's much more recognizable.
I stole
you
the
understand
punchline.
what I'm trying to say? No, it's brilliant because you put it better than I would have. Because I started off doing Aramean jokes and nobody got them, and I said, "Look, hang on a minute. What if I pretend that I'm an Arab and I've got like a 400 million potential pool of people who's gonna get that joke?"
Right.
So it's great, and this is why it's the same now when people say, why do you live in Britain if you criticize the British all the time? I was like, no, but I'm British. We're famous. Famous for our self-deprecation and right.
You said that somewhere else, that actually one of the things that attracts you to British culture is the fact that you can make these jokes and people understand that you are not being rude about them. It's a self-deprecating culture.
Yeah, it's absolutely, I love that about them. And I mean, it's not everyone to the same extent, and not particularly this week, maybe, but in general, they do have that. Because I used to always say this thing, like British really get like the self-deprecating humor, right? And especially when you're kind of making fun of your physical appearance or someone, and here, if you're doing it in Britain and people are, yeah, you get it, they don't even laugh, right? Because they don't want to give you the satisfaction. But like, but like in Lebanon, for example, the Arab world in general, and you're like, oh yeah, because I look so fat or I look so ugly, and people go like, let's say you're going like, oh, it's because I'm so ugly, and people will look at you very philosophically and say, yes, but looks are not everything.
Right. Right.
So you won't get away with it, what I'm saying? You won't get away with it, which is what makes it really challenging. Like a lot of the time, I'll tell you the funniest thing that's ever happened to me in the context. There's a Lebanese television presenter who does these kind of nighttime talk shows. It's called Zaven, and he draws a big audience. And he invited me once in his show in Lebanon, and they had like a live audience, quite hundreds of people in there, right? And first of all, I should have figured out from the introduction that he started telling some of my jokes, but it's done in like spoken Lebanese, obviously, and then he had to translate the jokes, and then he had to explain to the audience why the jokes are funny. And they still didn't get it. So I was there for like 20 minutes, right? Trying my best.
Awful. Sitting there listening to your own jokes.
Yes. And then I kind of tried to, maybe if I started like, speaking and trying to, and they absolute dead silence. They're looking at me like, it's like, I'm looking at them, they're all thinking this is the least funniest person in the world. Why are they even having him on TV? So it was brutal. I tell you, it was brutal. And there's video footage of it. It's available online and things. I won't share the link, but it kind of speaks of this. Something you very politely kind of alluded to, but you didn't delve into, which I'm in a very privileged position of having a kind of a certain audience that appreciates these things. But, the kind of the attempts at humor that I make, but they are not necessarily universal. And what makes it very painful is they're not accessible, to your own people sometimes, which is quite painful.
Yeah, I mean, again, even within the Arab world, I think different people would respond differently. I mean, you're generalizing a lot, but I mean, I do think sometimes one of the things I like about spending time in Egypt is that Egyptians are very willing to take the joke, like whatever it is, they're willing to see the humor in it, I think.
I mean, I always say this. I love Egyptians, massive generalization. They're the funniest people in the world. You know, they could just tell you, like, please pass me the salt, and they can say it in a funny way. Meanwhile, I find us, the Lebanese, very cringe, you know. Even when I watch myself, like trying to say something in
Mm,
Lebanese, and it's I don't find myself funny at all. So there's almost like they're naturally imbued by this kind of we call it خفة الدم in Arabic, you know, the just kind of a sense of humor, general sense of humor. And then there are others, like Iraqis are really, really good at very dark, bleak
very dark
humor,
humor.
and a
Yeah,
kind
that's
and being able to tell it
yeah.
in a kind of very dry way, right? They're
I
very,
think you
very
can
good
say
at that.
that a generalization about Iraqis, but I think that's right.
Yeah, no, I think it's
Yeah, yeah.
totally right. But you know, as you travel, and I kind of trying to cover as much of the Arab world and the Middle East as possible, you know, you realize people have different attitudes, different ways of dealing these things. What makes it great is there is a shared language and a shared enough pool of culture to start to kind of understand these differences.
Mm.
But even the people that, you know, people generally tend to think of, you know, the Gulf people, for example, as being over serious, which is really not true.
Not true at all.
You
Not
know,
at all.
it's really, really not
Not at
true.
all. Yeah.
And so maybe there's in the next chapter of my life, rather than demystifying, you know, Arabs to the West, you just gotta like demystify different Arabs to each other.
Well, it's a version of the British do this, the Italians do that, the Germans do this. I mean, the idea that the Germans are humorless is not true at all. Germans tell some excellent jokes. Actually, one of the nice things I think about the explosion of Netflix is that you start to see a lot of German stand-up comedians making their way to Netflix, and so it allows you access to the comedy of these cultures in a way that I
Yes.
think perhaps previously you didn't have.
No,
Um,
no, absolutely. Particularly the Germans. I mean, you look back at their cabaret tradition. You know, it. As I can't remember who said it. Is German satirists single-handedly put an end to Nazism? But yeah, it's a very dark joke. But yeah,
it's a
it's
dark joke that the British wouldn't appreciate. I guess neither the Russians either. So,
yeah. Well,
let's talk a little bit about the medium because this is something I always wanted to ask you about. That your satire seems very well suited to Twitter. Like it's pithy, it's shareable, it's the kind of thing that people from a similar community can understand. I wondered how. I know you've experimented with cartoons before. How much do you think the medium influences the satire?
Oh, it's huge. It's absolutely huge, and it suited me very well because I'm extremely lazy. And it's 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 like there's if you look at my cartoons or videos or all of these things, there is absolutely zero effort that goes into any kind of pretending to do things professionally or following through. And actually my cartoons were very popular but they were such a minimal style of drawing that they were kind of very quick to draw and things like that. So I think what happened is in a different era, I wouldn't have been able to find an audience because it would have like required someone to actually put some effort into these things. As it happened, the moment when I was ready to start kind of, doing comedy and humor and things, that we have the social media with this influence on, shorter things, bite-sized things, 5-second videos and things like that. So it's kind of like, it's perfect because, if I lived in the 19th century, I wouldn't be doing this podcast with you for starters. But it because previously needed to have kind of a level of dedication and perseverance and things like that. But
Mm,
and I used to try to do these things with kind of very carefully and put a lot of effort into them, and I realized that's not really appreciated. It's like
mm,
the craft that goes into things. That's not what people want out of it. You want to hit the topic that's now everybody's talking about, and you want to hit it in the most expedient way possible. And that's where, it starts off with when the original tweets, they were 140 characters. So it was absolutely brutal to get anything funny in that. But I still try to stick to that limit now, even though we have longer, because I think, once you hit that perfect one-liner, that's takes so much work to actually get it to that. So I'm for contradicting myself now, but it's my thing out of both kind of this lack of perseverance, but also is kind of resonates with this stuff. However, sorry, go ahead.
No, well, I was just going to say, I actually think it is very much of the comedy is very much of the moment. I think if you try to put too much thought into it, I mean, of course, you have to craft it in a certain way, but I think people appreciate when it is, when it's off the cuff. And I think certainly when it comes to jokes, the kind of jokes that you make, people want it to hit in a particular way, and they just want to hear it.
Yeah, it's true. And then, but also there's something else about it. And it's great when they invented the thread, because you can actually see how my brain is working if you go from one tweet to the other, as every 2 hours, I think of something new. So let's say when the news came out about Brexit, the result came out, and I was like, the country is being divided, and start joking along those lines. And then pretty soon I drew the map, right?
Yeah,
and then it's in the same thread. And then I made like a Berlin Wall right down Trafalgar Square, separating the two, the Remainers from the Brexiteers and all of that. So I think that's a great thing, because it's like a living thing, right? It's like you're doing real-time stand-up comedy, in the sense that you're writing it and performing it at the same time. And as people comment on it, you get like a better idea, right? You get inspired by something to say. It's a brilliant medium,
but the joke is 80. I completely understand what you're saying, but the joke is 80-90% done in its first draft. So there was one of the very few viral jokes that I've had was when, just before Boris Johnson was toppled, or just after rather, the Chancellor at the time, Nadeem Zahawi, who has Iraqi heritage, he was the person that finally pushed him out. And I put out a tweet saying, how nice, a British leader has been toppled by an Iraqi.
And of course, how did I not see that? That is brilliant.
Actually, I'll tell you something. Thank you. But I as that joke started to go viral, because it went out in the morning and started to get retweeted a lot, there was a part of me that thought, I need to check Karl hasn't done this joke. Because for sure, I was terrified of going to your Twitter and checking, and like an hour earlier you'd put it out, and I was like, oh man. But no, but the reason that I think I was saying about 90% of the joke, obviously once that started to go viral, people would then respond and say, well, technically he has Kurdish heritage, it's not actually Iraqi, and all of this kind of stuff. And it's not like the joke is 90% done the first time it is put out. When you start to tweak it too much, you lose some of the spontaneity.
Yes, but in certain exceptions. So the Kulthum joke that you really like, right? That didn't start with Kulthum. It started with Feiruz or someone else, right? And then people started replying. Someone says, now do Kulthum. And then I gave it the first shot. It was like, nah. And then I went away and thought about it, right? And when it hit me, I can't describe to you. It was like something visceral. It was like, obviously this is the joke.
That's the joke, right? Yeah.
And when it came, I was like, that's it. It's the format. It's everything. Right. And it's very interesting how these things, I agree with you. Sometimes it's kind of your very first reaction. But sometimes you just got to sit there and work at it and work at it and work at it. And genuinely, it looks like it's the most absurd thing in the world. But sometimes I'll knock it around. And some of these things I've had the idea, I managed to finally kind of come out with the right articulation a year later.
I'm sorry, I was wrong. I've taken some of your genius from you by assuming that it is all spontaneous. No, that's true, because actually a lot of the genius of stand-up comedians is their ability to hone a joke again and again. I think Chris Rock said this, that sometimes you need to hone it and you need to find the exact form of words. And I think that is right. That, of course, is what comedians do. So yeah, you're right. You have to find it.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I guess it's the medium allows you to do all sorts of things, and this is what I love about it. This is what I think brilliant about it. But in a way, what you said, when you started telling the joke, and you made the joke, and you said about Nadim Zahawi,
Yeah,
I found it really funny. I started laughing, and I swear to God, immediately I thought, I bet someone has then you can't say that because Nadim Zahawi is Kurdish now and he
exactly.
shouldn't be
Yeah,
called Kurd, right? But this is
exactly.
exactly the kind of thing that I was telling you about. I
Yeah,
wasn't talking about the level of censorship where someone is talking about power dynamics and whatever, and you try. This is the kind of like low level, just kind of. It's like, can we swear on this, by the way?
go ahead.
Okay, it's just like, for fuck's sake, let it go. It's a joke, right? Everybody understand.
Yeah.
You're not trying to kind of take away the Kurdish identity or anything. Everybody would understand the context of that. But this is
Hmm.
what gets me. This low level kind of actually, that is sort of is so tedious and banal. And the more space we give it, it's just I'm being not funny again. I'm gonna leave it.
But aren't you worried? I mean, as someone, you are genuinely funny, and I aspire to be funny. But in that context, don't you think you are worried about this defense that it's just a joke? I mean, in that context, I wasn't seeking to say anything about Nadim Zahawi. The joke, in fact, I think Nadim Zahawi has identified as an Iraqi, but to some degree, it doesn't matter. The joke doesn't work as if you identify him as a Kurd, because the British haven't done that. They didn't. Saddam Hussein was an Iraqi. It doesn't work otherwise. So,
Yeah, exactly.
but at the
But
same time,
yeah.
I wonder if you think this defense of, oh, come on, it's just a joke. Don't you get nervous about that? Because that could be leveled, that could be used by people who want to make nasty jokes, perhaps who do want to erase the Kurdish identity.
Yeah, of
For
course. The
example.
defense, no, but the defense kind of presents itself, right? If it's
Mm,
quite obviously a joke in which, nobody in that, you still have to make a judgment call, right? Just
right.
kind of, if you go about and make the most racist, awful joke in the world and say it's just a joke, well, obviously that's not an excuse. I'm still going to lay into you and call you like a racist,
Yeah.
whatever. But what I'm saying is that the it's a joke defense is made by the joke, not by you, right? Anyone can tell from that joke is your intention is not to undermine Kurdish identity or delegitimize the federal status of the Kurdish part of Iraq within Iraqi federalism,
Yeah.
or undermine the legacy of Salah ad-Din or any of those
All
things.
these jokes, frankly, we would have had to wait for 280 characters to do them. That's what we're talking about.
Exactly, which is why 140 was brilliant. But it's clear from the joke that your intent is none of these things. So that it's a joke defense is built into the joke itself. You can tell from the joke that's what's been, and it's like, come on, cut us some slack, and I always I talk about this because it's not even about that kind of thing, right? Like, if you make a joke in which you put two different characters from two different historical eras, people which are necessary to make the joke funny, right? Then
Okay.
people will very quickly there'll be people offended because they're like, these people lived in two different eras. How can you put them in the same joke?
Right, yeah. Technically, they wouldn't have met. And you go, well, that's why it's a joke rather than a historical drama on the BBC. Yeah, but I wonder also if it's to do with people getting to know you in some way. Because, I mean, in your case, you have, 12 years, you said, being on Twitter. People get to know you over that period of time, and they get to trust you to some degree. I mean, I see this with stand-up comedians. Of course, some of the things that stand-up comedians say can be shocking. Ricky Gervais, Jimmy Carr, Dave Chappelle. But to some degree, when you get to know them, you go with them on the journey of the joke. And I think that's probably what happens on Twitter, that people come with you to some degree because they say, look, we know what Karl Sharro is all about. We know that he's not making this joke because he dislikes any of these groups. Okay, let's go with him and see where we get to with it.
Yeah, that's true. And I have to give credit to a lot of people that have cut me a lot of slack over the years because they would have understood where I'm coming from. And I think that's another thing. It's like, the joke doesn't stand on its own. I think that's a great observation. It's basically a product of a whole kind of relationship that you build with people who are, willing to kind of be generous enough to entertain these things and follow you closely enough to understand that.
Yeah.
And that's, again, another, I think, brilliant thing. I mean, everybody hates social media. I love social media. So everything I say in terms of kind of, how it's against its regulation and things like that is out of my love for this medium, because it's fantastic, it's democratizing, it's liberating, it gives people like me who would have never been anywhere near any audience before an audience, and it's fantastic. I love it, and I love the people that I've kind of nurtured along the way, and also the people that I personally follow and find their output fantastic. I think this is really great stuff, and it's kind of, it leads to a lot of experimentation and new forms of humor and things like that. It's really nice.
Karl Sharro, thank you very much.
Thank you.
This has been The Lead, the New Lines Magazine podcast. You can find Karl on Twitter at Karl Remarks. His book, And Then God Created the Middle East and Said, Let There Be Breaking News, can be bought at all good bookshops. This week's episode was produced by Joshua Martin and hosted by me, Faisal Yafai. For more like this, subscribe to The Lead on your favorite podcast app or visit our website, newlinesmag.com. Thank you all for joining us.